She apologized for the roast being late, for the house being messy when it wasn't. That's when I knew. My name is Red Allen. Every morning I sit on my back porch with tea before sunrise. Same chair, same lake, same quiet. I thought I knew what peace looked like. My daughter smiled at every dinner, thanked everyone, made it all look effortless. But one evening, I saw her standing by her car outside a family gathering. One hand on the doorframe, not moving, just standing there, preparing herself to walk in. That's when I understood. The peace I saw wasn't hers. After my wife passed, quiet became something I learned to live inside instead of run from. I kept the same rhythms most days because rhythm can hold a man together when grief has already taken a few boards loose. I woke early, made coffee before sunrise, fed the birds off the back steps, and walked the short path down toward the water, while the town was still half asleep. My neighbors probably thought I was set in my ways, and they were right. At my age, routine is not stubbornness. It is stewardship. It is how you keep your own spirit from fraying around the edges. I have always believed in dignity. Not the loud kind people perform, but the quieter version. Say less than you feel. Notice more than you say. Do not make every discomfort into a spectacle. That was how I was raised, and for most of my life, it served me well. Even after I was alone, it gave my days shape. I kept the house in good order, polished the old wood banister my wife used to run her hand along, and wound my father's pocket watch every Sunday evening. It is a brass watch, scratched on the back heavy for its size, with a face that still catches morning light, in a way that makes time feel honorable. When I'm troubled, I hold it in my palm. It reminds me that steadiness is sometimes the last useful thing a man can offer. My daughter had that same steadiness once, though hers came wrapped in brightness. She was never timid. As a girl, she spoke like her thoughts had been waiting all day for a chance to arrive. She laughed, from deep in the chest, asked direct questions, and moved through the world as if she belonged in it. Even when she was young, she had a way of making decisions that made older people straighten up a little. She knew what she liked, what she didn't, and what she meant. By the time she was grown, that confidence had sharpened into independence. She built a life with good work, her own money, and the sort of taste that made any room warmer just by her being in it. When she married, I believed she had found someone solid. That is hard for me to admit now, but it is true. From the outside, everything about their life seemed respectable. Their home was beautiful without being flashy. Their holiday cards looked polished and tasteful. Their friends were educated, well-spoken, successful in the ordinary way people admire. At gatherings, there was always good wine, careful music, and the sort of conversation that lets everyone feel civilized. If you had asked me then, I would have said my daughter was settled. But peace can wear fine clothes. The changes came so slowly that any one of them felt too small to name. She still smiled, but more often, as if she were remembering to. She still dressed well, though something in her choices softened, as if she had stopped dressing for herself and started dressing not to draw notice. She still hosted, still thanked everyone, still made things look effortless. Yet, every so often I would catch a flicker pass over her face when her husband spoke from another room, or see her glance at her phone with a tightness that seemed out of proportion to an ordinary message. I told myself marriage changes people. I told myself parenthood exhausts even the strong ones. I told myself it was not my place to look too hard into another household, just because I loved the woman inside it. When she brushed things off, I let her. When she said she was tired, I accepted tired. Respecting her choices felt honorable. I did not yet understand that denial can disguise itself as respect. The apologies were what stayed with me. They came too quickly, and for things too small. Sorry the roast took longer. Sorry the house is a mess when it wasn't. Sorry she forgot to call back. Sorry the baby was fussy. Sorry she had to sit down. Sorry for nothing, really. At first it sounded like stress. Then it started sounding like habit. More than once I watched her shrink inside a perfectly ordinary moment, as if taking up less space might keep the air around her calm. The evening I remember most before everything broke was a family gathering at a relative's home. Cars lined the drive, voices carried through the windows, and from inside came the easy sounds of people who believed they knew one another well. I had just stepped out of my truck when I saw my daughter by the passenger door of hers, one hand still on the frame, not moving. She stood there, only a few seconds, but it was long enough. Long enough to look like she was gathering herself before walking in. I began finding reasons to stop by more often, though I told myself they were ordinary reasons. I'd bring over soup when the weather turned sharp, or a sack of oranges from the market, or a toy I thought my grandson might like. I never announced these visits as checks. I arrived as a father does when he still wants his help to look casual. From the street, the house was always immaculate. The lawn was trimmed close. The windows shone. Seasonal wreaths appeared right on time. Cushions sat squarely on the porch chairs, and every flower bed looked as if someone had measured the blooms. It was the kind of place neighbors complimented, the kind of house that gave the impression of disciplined success and good habits. Inside it was even more orderly, and that was where the unease deepened. The rooms were spotless, but felt untouched, as if life had been edited out of them. Toys were stacked too neatly. Blankets were folded without a wrinkle. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish, but never of simmering food or laundry, still warm from the dryer, or anything that suggested a family had relaxed there. I had lived in homes long enough to know the difference between clean and careful. This house was careful. My daughter moved through it with a light step I did not recognize. Not graceful, cautious. She lowered cabinet doors instead of letting them close. She answered simple questions after the smallest pause, as though checking the shape of her words before letting them out. Sometimes, her face would remain pleasant, while her shoulders told another story entirely. "How are you doing, honey?" I asked one afternoon, while she rinsed berries at the sink. "Good," she said quickly, "just busy." But her hand tightened around the bowl when she heard a car pass outside. It was not even his car, and yet she turned her head toward the window, with a look too sharp for an ordinary sound. A moment later, she smiled again, but it came back late, like something put on after the room had already noticed. Another time I was sitting at the kitchen table helping my grandson line up wooden blocks when her phone buzzed. She reached for it so fast one berry rolled off the counter and onto the floor. "Sorry," she murmured, though no one had asked for an apology. She glanced at the screen, her face tightening, before smoothing over. Then she looked up at me and said, "Everything's fine." That phrase began to follow her around the way a draft follows a loose window. Everything's fine. I heard it when lunch ran late. I heard it when a glass broke. I heard it when she had dark circles under her eyes and said she had simply been tired. The words stayed the same, but her body never agreed. Her hands were often cold. Her jaw held tension, even when she smiled. Once, when I reached out and touched her forearm to get past her in the kitchen, she startled so suddenly, we both went still. I asked careful questions because I did not want to corner her. "Are you getting enough rest?" I asked. "Do you ever get time to yourself? Are you happy here?" I tried to keep my voice level, the way a person speaks when he is offering a place to land, not setting a trap. She answered with soft evasions. "Everybody's tired. It's just a busy season. Marriage takes adjustment. We're doing our best." None of it sounded rehearsed exactly, but none of it sounded lived in either. It was the language of somebody trying to keep a lid on something that wanted air. What began to trouble me most was this: she never seemed afraid of what strangers might think. She was not managing appearances for the neighborhood or trying to impress friends. Her fear pointed inward, toward the front door, toward evening, toward whatever followed a wrong tone, a late reply, a dish left out too long. It was not public embarrassment she was bracing against. It was consequence. That realization shifted something in me. Up until then, I had been telling myself I was witnessing stress mismatch, maybe a marriage grown brittle at the edges. But brittle was not the right word for what I was seeing. Brittle things crack openly. This was something else. This was someone learning to live smaller, so the world around her would stay calm. I started reading at night after supper, long after the dishes were put away, and the house had gone quiet. I looked up patterns of coercive behavior, emotional dependency, controlling household dynamics. I did not use my daughter's name in any search bar. Somehow, that still felt like a betrayal. But every description I read seemed to turn the same key. A few days later, I called a woman in the next county who worked in family support and crisis guidance. I told her I was asking in general terms. She let me have that dignity. I described what I had seen without embellishment. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment before saying, "Love does not always mean acting fast. Sometimes it means staying steady enough to be useful when the person is finally ready." I wrote that down and kept the page inside the back cover of my desk drawer. That was when I understood this was no longer simple marital tension in my mind. It was something more deliberate than strain, and more dangerous than unhappiness. And the hardest truth of all was this: some people stay, not because they are weak, but because they have been made to doubt their own reading of reality. The restaurant was the kind of place people chose when they wanted the evening to look better than their actual relationships felt. White tablecloths, low amber light, polished silver waiters who moved quietly enough to make everyone else feel louder than they were. I arrived early, as I always do, and took the chair with the best view of the front entrance. Old habits. I liked to see people as they came in. Sometimes, the first few seconds told the truth before conversation had time to tidy it up. I ordered water and waited. When my daughter walked in, I felt something in me go still. She looked beautiful, but in the muted way a room looks beautiful after someone has taken all the color out of it. Her dress was tasteful, soft, forgettable. The sort of thing that would never offend anyone, never attract too much notice, never require explanation. She had once dressed like a woman who enjoyed being alive. That night, she looked like someone trying not to become a subject. Her husband came in beside her, one hand resting lightly at the small of her back. To anyone watching it would have read as attentive, protective even. But my daughter's shoulders were too high, and her smile arrived half a beat late. She kissed my cheek and asked how I had been. Her voice was careful, not tired, careful. The others joined us a few minutes later. His parents came in carrying the sort of confidence that belongs to people who mistake comfort for character. His father greeted the room as if it were a stage built for his opinions. His mother moved more quietly, almost elegantly, but with the particular stillness of someone who had spent a long time making herself easy to overlook. At first, the conversation stayed where polite family dinners tend to stay. Weather, travel, a child's milestone, the market, a neighbor's new porch, nothing deep enough to bruise. I watched my daughter move through it with that same soft precision I had come to dread. She laughed where expected, nodded when spoken to, kept her hands folded too neatly in her lap. Then the waiter came back to take another round of drink orders, and something small went wrong. My daughter corrected herself on a choice so minor it should have dissolved before it reached the table. Instead, her husband looked at her with a coolness that changed the temperature of the whole room. His tone never rose at first. That was part of what made it so chilling. He spoke as though he were addressing a disappointing assistant in front of a boardroom. One dry remark, then another. By the time she murmured, "I'm sorry, I knew I was no longer watching a disagreement. I was watching a ritual." That apology landed too quickly, too smoothly. It did not sound like a response to the moment. It sounded practiced, almost polished by use. Something inside me tightened. I tried to ease the tension with a simple comment to the waiter, light and dismissive the way men of my generation have often tried to smooth over what we do not yet want to name. For a second, I thought it might work. Instead, his father chuckled and added his own remark, one of those ugly little sentences dressed up as old-fashioned wisdom, the kind that makes cruelty sound like standards. His mother lowered her eyes. My daughter shrank by inches. And then the line was crossed. It happened fast enough that half the room pretended not to fully register it, though everybody did. A hand where no hand should have been. A physical assertion of control in a public place. My daughter's body reacted before her face did. Her breath caught. Her whole frame folded inward. There was no mistaking it now. What stunned me most was not only him. It was the adults around him. The way one excused it with silence. The way another normalized it with posture. The way an elder at the table treated domination as if it were unfortunate, but understandable, one of those things decent people are expected to look past for the sake of peace. That was the moment the family system revealed itself. I stood up, not because I had lost control, but because I had finally found it. My heart was pounding, but my mind had never felt clearer. I looked at my daughter then, at every adult who had chosen comfort over conscience, and I understood with terrible precision what had happened to all of us. Silence was the first thing I stopped giving. And once I was on my feet, I knew I could never again protect family comfort at the cost of my daughter's safety. I did not call the next morning, or the morning after that. Everything in me wanted to. Every fatherly instinct I had was already halfway to her front door. But instinct, I had learned, is not always wisdom. A frightened person does not need to be rushed into the truth. She needs to know the truth will still be there when she can bear to face it. So I chose restraint, but not passivity. I sent one short message each morning. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that asked her to confess. Just a steady line lowered into deep water. I'm here. My home is open. No questions unless you want them. The wording barely changed because I wanted her to feel its shape before she had the strength to use it. My house remained available, but the choice had to be hers. When she responded, the replies were brief and oddly polished. Doing fine. Busy day. Everything settled down. I read them carefully, not only for what they said, but for what they avoided. Sometimes the messages arrived quickly. Sometimes they came after long silences that left me staring out at the lake with my phone beside my tea, like a second pulse I could not control. I did not push. I answered gently and left space around my words. Meanwhile, I prepared. I started a folder in the bottom drawer of my desk beneath old utility bills and church newsletters I never quite threw away. Into it went dates, notes, screenshots, details too small for anyone else to notice, but too consistent for me to dismiss. A canceled visit. A sudden change in tone. A mark I had glimpsed and pretended not to understand. I added the number of a local family attorney, the address of a counseling center, the name of a women's advocate 2 towns over, and the spare key I had cut for my own back door, in case she ever arrived after dark with no time for ceremony. One afternoon, I drove over without warning and found the place even quieter than usual. My daughter let me in after a pause long enough to tell me she had not wanted to. The house looked perfect, and somehow more lifeless than ever. Curtains half drawn, cushions straight. Not a toy out of place. My grandson was asleep upstairs, she said, and the way she lowered her voice made the house feel like it had ears. We sat in the living room and I watched her choose every sentence like it had to survive inspection. She insisted things had calmed down. She told me I was worried over one bad night. But when I rose to leave, I caught her eyes flick upward, past my shoulder, into the corner of the room. I turned. There it was. Small, dark, nearly hidden against the trim. A camera. Once I saw one, I saw others. Near the hallway arch. Above the back door. A tiny, fixed lens aimed not outward toward danger, but inward toward life. My daughter followed my gaze and went pale, in a way no tired person ever does. She said they were for security. She said everyone had them now. She said it too fast. That was the detonation. The fear I had been tracing was no longer emotional weather. It was architecture. This was not a strained marriage with a temper problem inside it. It was an environment designed to keep one person monitored, corrected, and perpetually unsure of her right to breathe freely in her own home. The purpose was larger than intimidation. It was erosion. Day by day, choice by choice, she had been trained to second-guess her instincts before they ever reached language. If you were raised to believe silence kept a family together, you may understand why telling the truth can feel harder than leaving. That night, I could not sleep. Around midnight, an unknown number sent me a short video clip. It was footage of me in that same living room, sitting rigid on the sofa, hat in my hands, looking toward the staircase. Beneath it was a calm message, polite enough to chill the blood. It thanked me for caring and suggested that unexpected visits upset my daughter and created unnecessary stress in the household. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, after that my father's pocket watch open, in one hand, the phone face down in the other. The message confirmed what I needed confirmed. I was no longer dealing with suspicion, or instinct, or a father's imagination sharpened by grief. I was looking at a system built to make my daughter doubt herself, while everyone around her admired the wallpaper. After that, I stopped waiting to understand. I started preparing for the day she would finally say enough. A few days after the message from the unknown number, my daughter called and asked if I could come by on Saturday morning. Her voice was steady enough that someone else might have missed the strain in it. I did not. She said they thought it would be good for all of us to clear the air. That phrase alone told me what kind of meeting it was going to be. I arrived a few minutes early and sat in my truck with the engine off, watching a thin line of wind move through the shrubs by the porch. When the front door opened, her husband was already standing there, as if he had been waiting for me through the camera feed. He smiled the way men smile when they intend to remain civil at any cost, except honesty. Inside, my daughter was seated on the far end of the couch, with her hands folded together so tightly, her knuckles had gone pale. The room had been arranged for calm, coffee set out, pillows straightened, daylight softened by half-closed curtains. It was the sort of scene people build when they want reason to look prettier than truth. He began by thanking me for coming. Then, he used the language men, like him, prefer words designed not to reveal, but to blur. Misunderstanding, stress, tension, a difficult season, family overreaction. He spoke as though what I had seen at dinner had simply landed wrong from my angle. He was not denying the moment exactly. He was reducing it, sanding it down, trying to make it small enough for all of us to step over without dirtying our shoes. I let him finish. Then I asked, "When you say tension, what exactly do you mean?" He blinked, surprised, then answered in broad, careful terms about pressure work and everybody being overwhelmed. I nodded once and asked, "And when you say misunderstanding, which part am I supposed to have misunderstood?" He shifted in his chair. My daughter kept her eyes lowered. That is how the conversation went. He offered language meant to soften. I asked for plain meaning. He called it a rough moment. I asked whether rough moments usually leave people visibly afraid before anyone has raised a hand or voice. He mentioned privacy. I asked whether privacy now included recording visitors in the living room and sending them video clips afterward. His face changed then only briefly, but long enough for me to know the question had landed where it needed to. He turned toward my daughter and said softly, "See what I mean? Your father is making this into something bigger than it is." She flinched without moving. That is a thing some people do after they have lived too long inside correction. The body reacts even while the face stays still. I looked at her and said as evenly as I could, "You do not have to prove your worth by how much you can endure." She did not answer, but her mouth trembled. Then came the external turn I had not expected so soon. While he was speaking about how unfairly judged he had been, my phone buzzed in my jacket pocket. I ignored it once, then again, but the third vibration came with a message preview that caught my eye. It was from a young woman I recognized by name, only because I had quietly written it down earlier. She had once helped care for my grandson. The message was brief and direct. "I need to talk to you. I saw something and I saved proof." I did not mention it right away. I simply slid the phone face down on my knee and let the fact of it settle inside me. There it was, the outside truth I had been waiting for. Not rumor, not instinct, not a father's fear. A witness. I rose from my chair slowly, not to escalate the room, but to mark the moment. I'm going to say this once, I told him. Anything that touches my daughter's safety will no longer be hidden behind privacy, family loyalty, or good manners. The smile left his face. I am not here to fight with you, I continued. I am here to be very clear. If what I saw was the whole truth, then honesty will only help you. If it was not, then the days of calling harm a misunderstanding are over. He asked whether that was a threat. No, I said, it's a boundary. I turned to my daughter, then, not wanting the whole room to remain arranged around his power. My door stays open, I said. You do not owe anyone silence just because they expect it. No one raised their voice after that. No plates shattered. No dramatic ending arrived to tell me I had won anything. The line had been drawn, but the room still belonged to uncertainty. And as I walked back to my truck, I knew a boundary can change the shape of a story long before it changes the ending. The message from the young caregiver led to a meeting in a quiet diner off the highway, the kind of place where nobody asks why your coffee goes cold untouched. She arrived with a folder in her tote bag and the exhausted look of someone who had been carrying another family's secret in her chest. She did not dramatize anything. She simply told me what she had seen, what she had heard, and why she had saved a few things before she was told her help was no longer needed. There were photographs of bruises my daughter had tried to hide with sleeves and makeup. There were time-stamped messages asking her to come later than scheduled because the house was not calm. There was one short audio recording caught by accident, just voices in another room, but enough for me to hear the tone I had already come to know. Not loud, controlled, precise. The kind of voice that expects the world around it to contract. I thanked her, paid for her pie, and drove home more slowly than usual. I did not feel triumphant. Truth does not make a decent man feel triumphant when his child is the cost of it. But the balance had shifted. What had once lived only in glances, instincts, and unfinished sentences had stepped into the open. And once truth has company, silence starts losing its authority. The practical work began after that. I called the family attorney, whose number had been sitting in my desk drawer, and made an appointment under my own name. I changed the deadbolt on the back door and had the front porch light repaired. I cleared out the guest room, put fresh sheets on the bed, moved a reading lamp to the nightstand, and bought a small set of children's books from the used shop downtown. None of it looked dramatic, and that was the point. I was not building an escape fantasy. I was building somewhere ordinary enough to feel believable when she needed it. Safety, I was learning, is often made of unglamorous things. During those weeks, the pressure of truth began changing the social balance around them. Invitations dried up in small ways first. A couple they used to see often stopped dropping by. One relative who had laughed things off at dinner called less. His father's tone changed when he left messages. Still proud, still careful, but no longer effortless. People did not need a courtroom to sense when a story had started to smell wrong. My daughter's messages changed too. They were still short, but something in them grew less apologetic. She stopped explaining every delay. She stopped cushioning every sentence. One morning she wrote, "I may need to come by this week." No excuse after it. No softening phrase. I stared at that line for a long time before answering, "Come whenever you want. I'll be here." When she finally arrived, it was just before sunset. She did not collapse into my arms or deliver some speech she had been saving. She walked in carrying one overnight bag and stood in my hallway, looking suddenly younger and older at once. My grandson held her hand and leaned against her leg. She said, "I can't stay long." "Not yet. I just needed to see if this still felt real." "It does," I said. She sat at my kitchen table for nearly an hour, saying very little, while my grandson colored a page from one of the books I had left out. Every so often, she looked toward the back door as though waiting for someone to follow her in. But slowly, almost against her own habits, her shoulders lowered. The second twist came from a place I had not expected. His mother called me that same week and asked to meet in a public park. She sat beside me on a bench with both hands wrapped around a paper cup she never drank from. When she spoke, it was not to defend her son. It was to admit that she had mistaken endurance for virtue for most of her adult life. She said she had once believed keeping quiet preserved a marriage, when in truth, it had only trained everyone around her to call fear normal. Her regret did not erase a thing, but it deepened the tragedy. By then, consequences were no longer hypothetical. They were arriving on their own legs through witness distance, damaged reputation, and the slow collapse of control. And the evening my daughter fell asleep on my sofa, without once glancing toward the window, I noticed something I had not seen in years. She was quiet, and for the first time she was not afraid. It took time for our new life to start feeling like life, and not simply the pause after impact. Healing, at least the kind that lasts, does not arrive all dressed up with music behind it. It comes in plain clothes. It comes through breakfast dishes, school forms, grocery lists, therapy appointments, laundry folded while the house is quiet, and evenings when nobody is measuring the room before they speak. That was the work in front of us. My daughter did not come back to herself all at once. I do not think anyone truly does, after living too long inside fear. She rebuilt in layers. First came sleep, or something close to it. Then appetite. Then the ability to sit in a chair without keeping one ear turned toward the door. After that came smaller things that mattered just as much. She started choosing her own clothes again instead of disappearing into whatever felt safest. She began leaving a coffee mug half full on the counter because no one was there to read carelessness into it. One afternoon, I heard her laugh at something my grandson said in the backyard, and for a second, I stood motionless at the sink because the sound felt both familiar and newly earned. The practical pieces mattered too. She met with a counselor every week. She spoke with the attorney when she was ready, not when anyone pressured her. She started taking freelance design work from my dining room table, while my grandson colored beside her. Nothing about it looked dramatic. That too was part of the healing. We were not trying to build a perfect life to prove anything to anyone. We were building a livable one. The house changed with us. The guest room became her room only because she wanted it to, and eventually, because she painted one wall a soft blue I would never have chosen myself. Children's shoes began collecting by the back door. Crayons found their way into the kitchen drawer. The refrigerator filled with grocery notes, one school picture, and a handwritten reminder to buy more basil. It may sound ordinary, but that was the miracle. No one had to ask permission to take up space. No one had to apologize for breathing wrong, and we were not alone. Healing always needs witnesses, though not the grand kind. Mrs. Delaney from across the road began dropping off soup on Thursdays and pretending she had made too much. My fishing friend Warren fixed the loose hinge on the porch gate and never once asked a question my daughter did not volunteer to answer. A small support group met at the library annex every other Wednesday. Mostly women, 2 older men, and 1 retired nurse who knew how to listen without steering. My daughter went the first time because I offered to watch the boy. She kept going because in that room, people spoke without shrinking. Even my grandson changed in ways that arrived quietly. The first week, he startled at every raised voice on television, even the cheerful kind from game shows. By early autumn, he was sleeping longer and asking fewer questions at bedtime. He planted beans with me in the side garden and dug too hard with the little shovel. One morning, he looked up from his cereal and said, "This house is calm." I had to turn away under the excuse of getting more milk. The most important changes in my daughter were not visible to anyone passing by. They were in the boundaries. She began speaking aloud. "No, that does not work for me. I'm not discussing that right now. I'll decide when I'm ready." Small sentences, firm sentences. The kind that would have once sounded impossible in her own mouth. Every time she spoke one without trembling, I felt something inside me loosen. Late that winter, on a pale Sunday afternoon, I took my father's pocket watch from the top drawer of my dresser and carried it downstairs. The house was full of soft light. My grandson was on the rug, building a crooked little town out of wooden blocks. My daughter sat by the window mending the cuff of one of his sweaters, her face calm, in a way I no longer feared might disappear. I placed the watch in her palm and closed her fingers around it. She looked at me in surprise. "Dad, I can't take this." "Yes, you can," I said. "Time takes plenty from us. But sometimes, if we stay long enough to tell the truth, it gives something back too." She opened the watch and listened to its faint ticking. Then she pressed it to her chest and bowed her head. I did not say anything more because the moment did not need decorating. I had not saved her for her. I had only kept the door open until she could walk through it under her own strength. Peace begins when you stop handing your inner life to the people who once taught you to shrink. That evening, the windows glowed gold against the early dusk. My grandson fell asleep with one sock half off on the couch. My daughter stood at the sink washing strawberries, humming under her breath. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea cooling beside me, and watched light rest on the wood grain on the blue wall down the hall, on the small, ordinary life we had made. Nothing in that room was grand. Everything in it was earned. Thank you for staying with me through this chapter of my life. If any part of it felt familiar, I'd be honored to hear your thoughts in the comments. This story uses recreated characters and events for storytelling and reflection.